So thanks for everyone for joining us today. I'm Max, one of the founders here at World Forum Disrupt. For anyone who's new to World Forum Disrupt, we're a business events company focusing on facilitating thought-provoking and innovative conversations around a number of different business areas. One of which is, of course, data, which is why you guys are here joining us today. Usually, as a business, we'd be running around 30 plus conferences per year, but given the current climate, those events are on hold. But because of that, we're sort of doubling down on the digital content we're creating for you guys. And we wouldn't be able to create that digital content without the support of some of our partners. So I just want to take this opportunity to thank DevGraph for their support in creating this webinar. And we're also fortunate enough to have their CEO, Rahul, join us today. If you're not familiar with DevGraph software, then be sure to check them out. And if you want to speak to anyone from their team, then just drop your email in the chat and someone will get in touch. Awesome. So in today's webinar, our awesome speakers will be using the hour to take a deeper look at database migration to the cloud. If you do have any questions, feel free to submit these, and our panelists will try and answer these at the end of the panel. So you'll see at the bottom of your Zoom window, there's a Q&A function. Just type in any questions you have, and our panelists will try and get to them at the end. Awesome. So without any further ado, I want to introduce James Rutt. He's the Chief Information Officer at Dana Foundation. James is wearing a couple of hats for us today. He's going to be moderating the panel as well as being a panelist and providing his insight. So yeah, without any further ado, I'll hand over to James, and he can let the other panelists introduce themselves.
Okay, thank you, Max, and good day, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Today's topic, as Max alluded to, is Zero Downtime Database Migration to the cloud. So we're going to talk about some strategies, some experiences, some tactics that most of us on the panel have run into when we've been looking at migrating these databases into a cloud environment in some way, shape, or form, right? So I think it's going to be a very invigorating discussion, and I think we're all going to learn something, as I've already learned a lot from our previous discussions with the panelists herein. So to start out with, I'd like to go around the horn, so to speak, and have everybody introduce themselves, just quickly, their name, title, company, maybe a little bit of context afterwards. So I'll just start off with myself. My name is Jim Rutt. I'm the CIO and CISO of the Dana Foundation. We're located in New York City. We're an endowment-based foundation that funds grants for neuroscience research, neuroimmunology research, brain programs, and we do some publications around neuroscience and the brain. I'm going to go ahead and start asking our panelists to go ahead and do their own introduction. So Rob Williams, will you start?
Hey guys, my name's Rob Williams, and I'm a Chief Data Officer for Kane Anderson. It's an asset management company in Los Angeles, although I'm currently based in London, and though I spent most of my time in New York. Been in finance, data, started as a DBA 20 years ago, data warehousing, BI solutions, and now a lot of cloud engineering. So thanks for having me, and I look forward to talking with you guys.
Excellent. Thanks, Rob. Rob Leahy?
Hi, guys. My name's Rob Leahy. I'm the Chief Information Officer at NASA Goddard Space Flight Center in Greenbelt, Maryland. I've been in the federal government for nearly 30 years, most of that time at this little organization called the Internal Revenue Service. I just came over to Goddard back in February, and I'm happy to be here.
Thanks, Rob. And I'll be sure to watch for any financial stuff that I might bring up here, as it may be held against me. Rahul, why don't you take us home?
Great. Hi, everyone. Very glad to be here. I'm Rahul. I'm the CEO at ScaleArc, which is a load balancing solution within the DevGraph portfolio. But DevGraph itself is part of a larger group of companies called ESW Capital, where I play the role of CTO as well as head of innovation. And the ESW Capital group is a group of about 130 odd companies in the portfolio. We are in the business of acquiring enterprise software companies and transforming them. We adopted a cloud and remote org strategy back in 2007. So we've been constantly migrating everything that we acquire into the cloud with a global remote organization for the last 13 years. So very excited to be here and share some insights with the rest of the panelists here.
Fantastic. Looks like we're going to get a lot of breadth and depth in terms of your experience there. So that's wonderful. So let's kind of set the stage for the discussion today. I think the first question kind of will encapsulate, in terms of going down the path of migrating databases, and we'll get to the tactics as a result of that. So the first question, and Rob Wiliams, I'd like to start with you. The first question is, can you name one particular project or challenge that you've run into particular to moving a database, a data source to the cloud, and kind of give some context around that, if you could.
Yeah, so I've done in the last 4 years, I've really ramped up my migrations to cloud services. So one of them, I've done a fair amount, from Oracle migrations to SQL Server to MySQL. We've tried different, it comes down to what are you trying to move, right? What's the data scope that you're actually trying to pick up and move? But I've done, I tried Amazon DMS service, and love Amazon products, love Azure products. I wasn't able to get the DMS working. I then tried doing it through at the time, the Oracle Gateway. I was able to have a little more success, even though it took a little bit longer. I think the DMS is still a very good service. I was just trying different avenues to get going. It was more, we was a fast development, but that kind of out of the box, here's a solution that'll work. Don't worry about it, it's sold by Amazon, didn't quite work for us. Support was helpful. We end up just kind of moving our own, just using the Oracle Gateway, and we were able to achieve our same goals, but it was much slower, whatnot. That was just one example of how it didn't work. Many examples of solutions that were very successful.
Now, Rob, interesting. I mean, you mentioned Oracle, you've mentioned SQL. Any experience of moving non-relational databases like NoSQL or anything like that? And I'll ask the other panelists as well.
Yeah, not me personally. My bread and butter has been Azure, AWS, Oracle, and SQL Server.
Okay, great.
And pretty much all those flavors in between.
All right, excellent.
Thanks.
Well, we'll get definitely into the tactics around each one of those as we move along. Rob Leahy, would you care to answer that question?
Sure. So we've got a project that we're doing right now. We call it the Goddard Commercial Cloud. We basically have stood up a cloud instance with AWS, and we've got customers that we're in the process of migrating. We're not doing lift and shift. It's mostly new work. The challenges that we're running into is the initial investment to get it ready. In government work, we have to do a lot of testing and certifications, and it has to be FedRAMP approved, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of upfront capital investment that goes into making sure we're good to go and establishing the connections, et cetera. Our problem is we haven't had a good funding stream to do that capital investment. So filling those gaps has been a challenge, and so that's been one of our biggest challenges, is doing that, building that initial infrastructure.
So it sounds like you're doing primarily greenfield implementations. Am I understanding that correctly?
That's what we're starting with new projects that are coming online. A new satellite for a ground system, and all of them tend to be very unique. At least they think they are. They're snowflakes. And so we're starting with that, and my goal is eventually utilizing a cloud infrastructure to get to a more common infrastructure across all of our flight projects.
Sure. Okay, thanks for the context. Now, Rahul, I know you've got a long history of doing these things, so I'm sure there's one or two that you can pick out and talk about.
Yeah, actually what I'm going to do is I'll probably step back and kind of give a little more context of where some of the common patterns. I think having done this many, there are certain patterns that you start seeing that are very interesting. And the one that kind of stands out, which we see every single time, is we all talk about having three-tiered architecture applications that we're trying to make, that we're trying to migrate from on-premise to the cloud. And the notion that we have three-tiered architecture is actually wrong. between the web server and the app server, we've got great decoupling that comes as a result of the HTTP protocol. So you can scale the web server and the app server independent of each other. You can move stuff around. It gives you phenomenal flexibility. But when it comes to the app server and the database, even though we think of them as two completely different systems, they are very strongly coupled with each other via the SQL or whatever the custom database protocol is. There is business logic that is supposed to be in the app, but it gets written into the database. There is data that's supposed to sit in the database and keep the app stateless, but that is taken out of the database and kept in memory or in the app in different states. So there is very, very strong coupling between your app server and the database. And I think the biggest challenge in migrating stuff over is finding the right seams, where you can start decoupling these things. And once you do that, that's when the migration becomes simple. So as we've looked at, migration after migration, I think we've done about a few thousand now. That is the one pattern that kind of stands out, that the decoupling is just not there. And which is why when we acquired ScaleArc, it became a very interesting product for us in our portfolio, not just for us, but also for our customers, because we started seeing that as a mechanism of decoupling some of these applications from the databases. But that really, if I were to break it down, that is the key challenge of migrating to the cloud.
That's some great context, Rahul. But I wanted to touch a little bit more on this coupling between the app and the database server. Are there any specific artifacts for us as practitioners that we should be focused on when we aim to decouple both the app and the database server in this regard?
Yeah, I think it is fundamentally the SQL protocol that is, causing all that decoupling. Like, what you really need is something that allows you to, switch wheels on a flying aircraft, right? Or, make big changes while the system is still running, because the data is always live. In most real-world applications that are truly valuable from a migration standpoint, right? The ones that will give you the maximum bang for your buck if you migrate them to the cloud. You don't have that affordability of letting your application shut down for a while you move stuff over and then start them up back again. So you almost need the equivalent of your Nginx web servers, or basically all your HTTP proxies that you have between your web servers and your app servers. You need something similar that sits between your app servers and your databases that allows you that flexibility to switch the wheels, on a running aircraft or on a running vehicle. And that is, that is a challenge. It's not simple. It's not straightforward. It's a very complicated thing, given how much coupling there is. The protocols are also non-standard, and a bunch of them are proprietary. So making sure that you have that capability, or you've managed to create the right seams, whether it be, okay, I have a very strong understanding of how the stored procs are, where the business logic is, how it's segregated, how much state of the database is actually stored in memory or within the app servers while they're running. All of that become really important. You need to have a good understanding of that before you can just decide to switch things over.
Yeah, it's kind of like threading the sewing machine while it's still running, right? That's
Correct.
another great analogy. But I like yours
Absolutely.
as well. Thank you so much, Rahul. So now that we've kind of set the stage, let's start talking more from a strategic perspective when we start to plan this migration. Typically, they fall into a couple different buckets. So one is what's colloquially termed as a big bang migration, or just cutting over cold, or a staged or parallel migration. And there's obviously pros and cons to both of those. So that would be my question is, in your experience, what are the pros and cons? What have you found to be the most salient method of migrating to the cloud, your database to the cloud? And Rob Wiliams, I'd like to start with you and get your thoughts on that.
So pros and cons of Big Bang versus parallel. To me, it's always been forced. Kind of one of those decisions have been forced. I would say, the pro of the Big Bang is you're done that weekend or whenever, a couple hours, and I think Rahul, you said it, when your hair's on fire running around, but you do get done. So that might be the only pro, and then you kind of deal with the fallout, and which is also a pro. You kind of make it a successful project, or you're going to roll back. Now, I think from a con, it's very challenging. You do run around with your hair on fire. You have a limited window, and so that's obviously a con. So the Big Bang sometimes is just required. It's just, you don't have any other luxury. You have so much time to get it done. You may have to apply the database, apply some sort of logs, kind of keep them synchronized, and that kind of rolls into the parallel method. And if you can, I've always found the parallel much more successful. I'm currently running a completely parallel warehouse it's already in the cloud, but it's so much easier to set up the services just to duplicate each other. It's just another piece of code that we just start running. So the parallel method, whether it's going from a legacy to a cloud solution and you're going to take backups and nightly, a lot of that can be, DevOps scripted, right? Now the whole world's DevOps and a lot of this stuff. So you can really set up your parallel environment to be, near real time, if not exactly, if you can control the write. So then the problem becomes, who are your writers, right? And as also Rahul was saying, finding that seam is very challenging. A lot of times the code's all writing to the same place. If you can start getting that seam kind of split, putting your writers in certain buckets, those app servers that are actually changing data become much more critical than the readers. So I think the answer to the pros, cons, Big Bang is a pro, it's done. Con, it's very challenging. Pro and parallel is it's a continuation. You're always making more improvements. So it's a much less stressful time. And most of the software can handle such parallelism, not parallelism, but parallel servicing. So it's actually, I think, an easier solution if it's possible.
Yeah, it's great insight there. The biggest concerns I've always had in my experience has been also the end user impact from, not only from an experience perspective, but also how once migrated, how the performance is going to be, and their perceptions thereof. Not just as well making sure everything is normalized, et cetera. So that's great, some great insight. So Rob Leahy, I know that it sounds like, based on what we talked about before, you do primarily greenfield implementations, but if you have any insight on some of the migration strategies that we're discussing, that'd be great.
Yeah, the greenfield is what we're doing right now at Goddard. I have done other types of migrations, and I really like the way Rob Wiliams detailed that out. The pros and cons for doing the Big Bang or doing it in parallel, or what I would say is more incremental. The way I think about it is there's always going to be issues, right? And you try and identify issues and take care of them through testing, through mocks, through pilots, whatever it may be. Big Bang, you're going to have issues and you're going to have to get them resolved really quickly, and you're going to put a lot of stress on the team members, and that'll get back to the customer experience. Is it going to affect the customer experience significantly or not? Sometimes you have to do Big Bang for whatever reason, but if I prefer to do it more of an incremental way, because as those issues come up, you're able to knock them down. You're not stressing the team quite as much in a very focused way, and you're able to keep your customers in a better situation. So overall, I like doing it more of an incremental, if possible. It may appear to cost a little bit more, because especially if you're running parallel, you might be paying for two platforms. But I think in the long run, being able to do it more efficiently, with fewer problems affecting the customers, or being able to knock them down quicker, will lead to a better result overall in the end, and get you there. So
yeah, I would agree on the cost factor. Typically, in my experience, we've had capital restrictions where we're kind of forced to go to a Big Bang kind of migration. And unfortunately, the conservative part of me always loved, the nature of a parallel migration. I think obviously, there's much more opportunities for recovery, as well as being able to manage the expectations like I alluded to before. So great insight.
One of the things that we did with a very, very large migration back at IRS a few years ago is we had a fallback plan, you know, and we had key gates where we evaluated everything at certain points where we kept going, and we could always fall back if needed. We didn't need to, thankfully, but we had that as our contingency. So.
Always great to have. I always sweat if I ever find myself in the position of having to execute such a plan, because you know there's always gaps in the road that you never think about until you actually hit that. But great insight, Rob. Thank you so much. So, Rahul, I'm sure you've run into this many times, as we've alluded to. What's your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I completely agree with both Roberts on this. I just have one other thing to add, which is I think the Big Bang approach is an ideal approach in an ideal world where you know exactly what the variables are. You know you can afford the downtimes on your app. You have the time to migrate stuff over, check it, test it, and then turn it on. Unfortunately, the world is far from ideal. So, you know, you're always going to be, I think like I stated earlier, you're going to have people running with their heads on fire, trying to tackle all of these variables that, you know, keep creeping up back on you. And from a cost standpoint, you know, even when you do manage to afford the downtime, more often than not in the past when we've tried to do this, we spend weeks, if not months, negotiating with customers on, you know, maintenance windows where we can do these things. And if you really look at the cost of waiting a few months before you can actually do, you know, shut down everything, move stuff over, I mean, the cost far outweighs, you know, moving to the cloud is way cheaper, even if you were running things in parallel, than waiting that long to switch over, because a whole lot of other variables are changing while you're just waiting for that maintenance window to arrive. So I think in the scheme of things, running things in parallel is more realistic. If you have ideal scenarios, great, Big Bang might actually work. But I've rarely ever come across that kind of scenario.
So yeah, I think you've alluded to a number of items there in regards to the cost of moving to the cloud in general. And you know, my perspective was always in terms of any kind of application or operation in the cloud is you completely remove the pressure should you come into a business continuity situation. That was kind of the thing that drove me towards our overall migration to the cloud at Dana. Having been through 4 major disasters in the past 20 years, this one I would count, this pandemic I would kind of count as a 5th. It obviously there's a tremendous amount of benefit, cost, operationally, continuity wise. I mean, there's just no match for it. And I think it's proved itself out as a result of this incident that we've had over the past few months. So great insight there, Rahul. So now we've kind of set the stage. We've talked about a couple of projects relating to migrating databases to the cloud. We've talked about different strategies, some tactics. Now let's move the conversation to, now we're going to move our database into the cloud. What context should it be in? So should it be a database as a service offering? Should it be a native SQL instance in a container environment or regular VM environment in an IaaS environment? So I'd love to get some insight there. And Rahul, let's start with you and let's switch things up. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, for this, if I wear my CTO hat for the entire group managing thousands of databases, I would lean towards, very heavily towards, reducing the complexity of my operations, and therefore I favor managed services a great deal. As an organization, you have to pick a few areas of strength. Being really strong in a whole lot of areas is incredibly hard to do, right? So you always want to pick areas where you want to put all your focus, be really great. And as a software development org, it's got to be, that area has got to be the value you deliver to your customers in terms of the software you build, right? All the other pieces are peripheral. They're like utilities. And just like you don't go, building your own generators to create electricity in your place, if you have a utility provider who gives you a managed database as a service with all the best practices bundled in, and all the redundancies and all the, cool new innovations built into it with security, elasticity, scalability, why try to manage it yourself? It's not an area of excellence or expertise that I am trying to build within my org. So I wouldn't want to invest in it. So I'd much rather go use a managed service. It feels like a far better solution with reduced complexity.
So Rahul, I think you've been bugging my office for the past 5 years or so, because this is the argument that I've been promulgating in our organization forever and ever, when they keep coming back to me and saying, why do we even have to discuss this? Besides the continuity factors that I've talked about, I've learned that there's not much gain in having that weight of responsibility in terms of the internals that aren't seen from the external by major stakeholders, and having to manage those. I'd rather have the subject matter experts that do this day in, day out, handle that, especially when we talk about like patching, maintenance operations, et cetera. Wherever possible, I always want to shunt those off to a managed service. Again, there are some other advantages to keeping it native, and I'm sure we'll have some insight on that as well from the other panelists, but absolutely in line with that. And that's kind of the from a Dana perspective, that's the way we've been going. Rob Leahy, how would you weigh in on this?
Yeah, interesting. I think, as in a world where things are a nirvana, right, where life is good and we get everything we want, and every day looks like your background. Yes, I would say that makes a lot of sense. In the organizations I've worked with in the government, very unique mission needs, whether it's tax administration or flying satellites or science missions from spacecraft and many gazillions of miles away, very unique. So I think that it really depends on what the mission is and how it's being serviced and what kind of applications and databases you're running. At IRS, we're running a lot of legacy, which made it very hard to go to managed service, especially when you're talking flat files, okay? So very old type of architecture. At NASA, we're much more modern, but even so, what we're dealing with is it's unique operations. You don't see a lot of that in the world. What we do, mission operation centers for controlling spacecraft. So I agree, generally speaking, great to use what's baked into a service. However, unique customer needs may dictate that we have to do something else.
Yeah, I would also probably surmise that life and safety is kind of critical for some of the data that you're dealing with as well, given some of the mission data that's probably mission critical. So that kind of adds to the argument as well, I would assume.
We have astronauts in a spacecraft, circling the globe every 90 minutes, and that is foremost on our minds as far as safety. Yes, so it is life and health and safety issues.
Much more than just telemetry about mechanical operations, et cetera, I'm sure.
Right, exactly.
Great insight. Thank you so much. Rob Wiliams, what do you say?
Great. So this is one of my favorite topics, I think, for sure, of all of this is you talk about the cloud but is it a database as a service, or are you going to just put the database in the cloud? And I think everyone's touched on great points and they're all accurate. I would, as Rob, which I'm now going to say NASA Rob, is right. If there's stuff I imagine some of the stuff that's so complicated and so critical, mission critical, that it's not really an as a service platform. You need to run the database yourself. But even still, I'd say I bet you some of their tier 1 support is top notch. They probably could even run it better than you can. Now, again, NASA is a little bit of a different story. So I think there are some certain circumstances that limit you from going to database as a service. Some of your releases, if you're on an old SQL Server, if you're on an old Oracle or whichever version, you may not be able to do the jump up to what's necessary to their minimum. You may have to go into a VM as is, run your install, do your normal migration, and then move over to as a service. But putting those kind of circumstances up, I think there's another example of where the vendor won't do it, and you've got some software solution and you have a backend, and they're not ready to support it. They're not quite there yet. I find this the most irritating, because on your big databases, the as service is going to support 99% of the things that you don't need, or that you do need, right? The 1% that's some weird PL SQL or T SQL or some piece of code that they don't really run on the database as a service, you're probably not using that anyway. Especially not the third-party vendor, but they just aren't ready to support it. So complexity, release, third-party apps not ready to support it. Those are the cons. I say, yeah, you probably can't do it. So then you still need your DBAs and you still need your team managing these databases, these backups, restores, performance, all that stuff, installations, plus the operating system on the VM and all that. So now flip the side, and the database as a service. I mean, I was a DBA. It's life, and not life changing by any means, but it's certainly day and night of what's required from a database perspective. There's so many advantages. Backups are kind of obsolete. The idea is obsolete. It's all done for you. You can restore them anytime you want. You can shut them down. Everything's scripted. Again, DevOps is your way to go. You basically can spawn them up, spit them off, bring them down. Plus, not even when they're running, you can then change the performance. I want more CPU, less CPU, which then dictates your IO, your memory, and down the chain. It's just a toggle. So everything is so flexible that there's just I don't see any reason why you wouldn't, except for those other 3 cases. It's such a new way of doing things. It's pretty impressive. So now everything I build is always as a database as a service. And I get very frustrated when some vendor tells me I can't because they're not ready yet, or we kind of keep going. I have to do an install or some whatnot on a VM. So I think it's absolutely the way that all these databases will be going. Not to mention, then the functionless and actually going on with the containers. The CPU themselves is going, serverless. So it's the way, in my opinion. And it's definitely very interesting what it's done to database and data technology.
Yeah, I think it's going right in lockstep with the way de-abstraction of compute is going, right? From VMs to containers, down to function, down serverless. I think it's all going in lockstep. And I think, but, obviously there are certain extreme examples, or certain example like Rob's obviously is much more critical, from many different angles. Nonetheless, I agree with you, Rob Wiliams, and Rahul and everybody, that I think it certainly has its place, its stake in the ground in terms of database as a service. I think it will continue to gain prominence. It's just a matter. I think part of it also will take some acclimation from folks that are typically used to working at a native environment. But as we do more and more migrations, as we build more stuff natively in the cloud, I think that learning curve and the adoption curve are going to ramp right up. So that's great insight. And I would just take one exception to one thing you said, Rob Wiliams, that being a DBA is not life-changing. I'm sure it would be life-changing if your migration didn't go so well. It might be in some way. So great insight. So in the meantime, we've gotten a couple of questions in the Q&A that kind of gone in lockstep with the ones I had prepared. So I'm gonna combine a couple of these because they kind of relate to each other. We're gonna start with Rob Leahy. I'm gonna talk about, give me one of the biggest unknowns that you've seen in your experience that during a migration that cost you a tremendous amount of time and energy, and you said, God, this is the best lesson I've ever learned when it comes to database migration in general.
I was pondering that, and my response was going to be unknown unknowns, things that you got to hit something. And in the migrations I've done, it's generally a unique type of condition that operates one way on one platform and another way on another platform, and trying to be prepared for that and test if you can, and if you can't, understand as much as possible how the differences in platforms might cause an execution problem, and be prepared and have the fire trucks ready, have the the smoke jumpers ready to jump in wherever it may be. So I can't put my finger on one thing, but I've seen multiple different things, and it's someplace that just comes out of the blue, and you just got to be ready to react and bring all the all the personnel in to deal with it right away.
That's a great insight. I'm thinking any kind of preemptive exception handling, where you might have to make sure the triggers, procedures, et cetera, you're not exactly sure how they may function in there.
Right, and you've got to have those gates where you're reviewing things, right? As soon as you come up, making sure that this is right and this is right, this is right, and have it in tiers. And okay, tier 1 is is it is yours are your applications running, or your databases running? Tier 2, are you beginning to see the results you expected? Tier 3, what's happening with the customer experience, or whatever it may be. I'm just kind of making this up off the fly, but be able to triage it and then jump in where you need to.
All right, no, great insight. Thank you so much. So Rahul, I know you've got one thing that sticks out in your mind that you can share that's like the golden nugget in terms of being able to save all of us a ton of grief.
I think I'm with Rob over here in that the lessons that we've learned is that you should always be prepared for something unexpected to show up. And it's rooted in that fundamental understanding that the system that you're moving from is different from the system that you're moving to. Even though it might be the same database version, if you really understand, and no disrespect to the DBAs, I think they've done a heroic job of keeping databases alive in different scenarios. But what's happened over the decades is that activity has become, they've built unique scaffoldings around every instance of a database to keep it up, to keep it running. You will find environment variables or certain embeddings within the way the database is set up and run, or the fine tunings that they've run on the database over the many years and decades that has never been documented, or that you don't know of, especially when the database and the product are a decade old or more. When you're moving to this brand spanking new system, it's not equivalent, and you really have to understand that they are not equivalent. So you kind of have to brace yourself that there are going to be certain unknowns. And I think the best preparation there is set up your migration process in such a way that you're constantly, like Rob said, checking. And if you could have blue-green deployments in little bursts where you could just check, make sure everything is working. If not, roll back, find a remedy for it. If you could have that mechanism, that's the best bet you can have towards a successful migration. Because just understanding that they are fundamentally different systems, where you don't know all the variables over there more often than not, is, I think, your best defense that you can start applying.
I picked up a couple of things from there that were, from a practical perspective, rechecking your environment variables, checking any kind of scripts that may have changed the tuning parameters of the database. These are things that we, typically when you do a review of these things, it's like going back to DBA 101. You have to start from the very simple artifacts in the database, the structure, the schemas, and all, and onward and upward, and act like it's a new database in order to make sure you get the maximum amount of situational awareness about it. So that's obviously some great insight as well. Rob Wiliams, I don't think I asked you this yet.
Yeah, I think I can just reiterate the group consensus. The unknowns are always going to get you, And really what you've all said, the performance, the post-performance can be a killer, because your testing, we test and test, and we always test and test, but statistics, databases, they're not always the same. It is a new system. So for sure, the performance is a gotcha. It's gotten me several times. But I'd add one more thing when I do the migrations, or anytime I've done something like the kind of either whether it is Big Bang or parallel, I always look, in my data world, what am I going to get from the migration as well? I'm either going to get more CPU, more memory. I'm going to get some feature in the database if I'm doing an upgrade. And most shops will know where their Achilles heels is inside the data, right? You've all got probably these couple big tables that always cause you problems. They cause performance problems, backup problems, whatever it is. Is it, can you think about giving yourself a fix while doing the migration? Take some solution to help yourself. I've always kind of pushed that in with my migration, so I know I'm kind of, what do I get as migrating all this data? I want something. I want this feature from rebuilding indexes, or this feature from I want a faster box. So I always looked at it that way, as kind of selfishly, what can I take while we're doing all this work to make my life easier later? And that seems to help.
So we got some great insights, and we got some great practical advice as well. So it's some great review, and thanks to the attendees for that question. We have another one as we move into kind of a different angle on migration, in terms of risk, in terms of privacy, right? So as a CISO, I get bombarded with all these issues, all these regulations, all these products relating to data privacy. And I think that has a specific impact, especially during migration and post-migration as well. It involves the planning, how you're going to structure, in terms of you're going to structure your data differently. You're always keeping an eye on regulatory encumbrances. So I want to pose that to the panel as well and get your insights. So Rob Wiliams, why don't we start with you and your insights in terms of privacy issues during the migration, post-migration, or how you would plan in response to the many regulations and privacy concerns that we all have.
Yeah, I think that I too would almost be asking some of these questions. So right now, I've come from the finance world, so most of everything it's not a product that we're making for the outside world. And I one time had a group of developers working for me, and I said, yeah, just open it up to the world. And they literally opened it up to the world. I was like, no. I don't open up anything to the world, right? We have very, very private networks. In fact, all my databases are whitelisted just to get the IP addresses down. So we don't allow any traffic in. So I'm not going to be able to answer probably as much as the other guys as well. But what I am now personally investigating is within the Azure services. I've done AWS and Azure, and recently I'm just on an Azure team, and I love it from a data engineering perspective, and that's just a sidebar. But within my Azure services, what kind of encryption can I do? And there's many products out there, but I've even talked to them, and they're not even quite up to speed with inside cloud itself. AWS service to AWS service, Azure service to Azure service, whether it's Redshift to a Lambda function or SQL Server internally. I'm trying to get some insight on that. So if anybody has products that they've heard or any encryption that they've looked into, I would be happy to learn something here myself. So that's where I'm right now, and my privacy is inside my cloud. What else can I add to really, really make sure that no one else is on this line? But overall, we've never allowed, we're not an outside product, and I haven't been. So that's my breadth of knowledge. But thank you.
So you kind of teed it up for me. I certainly have some insights on encryption, homomorphic encryption products that could help. We can, I can post that for, I don't know if it's appropriate to do here because I'm an advisor to the company, but we'll certainly circle back and give you some insight there. So Rob Leahy, what do you think?
Well, federal government has a lot of rules and regulations around privacy. We have to do these little things called privacy impact assessments for all of our systems, and we're very clear about systems. Plus, we have to do security authorizations and security assessments and things. So we're constantly doing reviews, not just around privacy, but around the entire security posture of everything we're doing. So it's quite rigorous, and the organizations I've been in take it very, very seriously. IRS obviously has the most sensitive personal information on all Americans and anybody who's done any work in the United States. So we were very careful to make sure that we were we had multi-layered defenses, if you will. Okay, from a vulnerability perspective, but also I have to look at it from the insider threat perspective. So we would have an application that if someone was accessing an account that they weren't able to, it would flag that and would generate alerts and things like that. So there are multiple different ways to ensure privacy, both from the, okay, encrypting a database at rest, encrypting data in transit, ensuring that people only with a need to access have access to the records, and said records, not database, but specific records within the database, and then making sure that there's audit trails for all the access, and that having active systems in place to block people, even from an insider perspective, trying to get there. So privacy is, especially, as I said, at internal revenue is number one in everybody's mind. So we're very careful to follow the rules and regs and make sure we were on top of it. And I'm trying to do the same at Goddard.
Interesting way that this conversation is angled. It wasn't the way I really thought it was going to, but it's interesting nonetheless. I think from an encryption perspective, this has been a battle that's been going on and on. How do we encrypt and secure our data versus the performance impact and the other operational impacts around that? So that's kind of one area. The other one is, in terms of the regulatory encumbrances and how, not only from the outside, but you mentioned insider threat. Yep. And in my career, in my instance, every incident, of all the incidents that I've had to deal with, both as a CIO and a security professional, I'd say the vast majority of them were from the inside, not from the outside, which brings that into a higher focus because we all worry about how we're going to hold the Bastille gates from the outside, from the perimeter, even the understanding that today there is no real perimeter. Whereas inside, it's much, much more difficult to formulate a strategy about your own internal resources and how do you make sure that you're securing them in such a proper way that risk is reduced to an acceptable amount. So that's some great insight, Rob. Definitely.
Yeah. Well, one of the things new for me coming to NASA is we have ITAR information, international something. It's data that cannot be transferred to organizations outside of the U.S. It's very sensitive. It's like things like dealing with aerospace, et cetera. And there's only certain companies or certain organizations that have access to that. So we have alerts of certain foreign actors who are extremely active in trying to penetrate our defenses to retrieve this information because they're trying to build their aerospace industry up to surpass us. So we're dealing with this in a very in a cyber warfare perspective every single day, and it's fascinating the attacks that we get and how we have to be very dynamic in taking care of our data.
Yeah, especially when you meld clearance-based security with data level security, I think it's a fascinating subject, and we could probably have another conversation all around that.
Absolutely.
Rahul, what do you say about this?
I think we come from a slightly different world. So while some of our applications and products require, that level of security and privacy, more often than not, when we acquire these companies and are migrating them to the cloud, we find that we are actually moving to a far more secure, far more, a far better system from a security privacy perspective than where we acquired them from. Like some of our companies that we acquired, they would run servers in their offices, under somebody's desk in some cases. These are not mission critical kind of, pieces of software, but still, there are some in that extreme end of the spectrum, while some of them actually require, HIPAA compliances or other certifications, which, to be honest, it's actually easier to get them with all the infrastructure and the security protocols that are set up by these cloud providers than trying to build them from scratch at our end and then having to certify them, because the certification processes can take months, right? And like if you have a credit card, an app that uses credit cards, the PCI compliance certification that you have to get just because you're storing credit cards is a 6-month-long process. Every time you do a release, you have to go through that entire certification process. So we try to rely on, again, these cloud vendors to help us mitigate a lot of those risks, buy into their best practices that they recommend. And in, I'd say, 100% of the cases, we are actually moving to a better system than we inherited when we buy these companies. So we come from a slightly different world and a slightly different perspective, I guess, over here. So for us, these are always better. Now, in terms of just one other part, which is invariably when we're moving all of this data, and this is, I think, where one of the big concerns comes in. These are not things that we move over the public cloud, right? I mean, we leverage things like direct connect links, because just the sheer volume of data that we're moving over is non-trivial. You don't want to send this over a little, internet pipe that you might have. So you typically bring in a direct connect link that literally patches at one end in your data center onto your machines, and the other end goes straight to an AWS data center or whatever. Or if you're moving stuff within, cloud providers from one place to another, you use private links and stuff like that to ensure that the data is secure. They're being transferred, with all the best practices around encryption and stuff. And now with even with the cloud providers, the notion of, I think most services are becoming more open to customers storing and running their own keys, where even the cloud providers don't have the keys. So while they do their encryption and all of that stuff and get all the compliances, now a lot of the services that you see on AWS and so on will allow you to manage your own keys and will let you encrypt all the data and everything by yourself. So I think over the next few years, you'll see a lot more of that happening across all the different AWS services, where these cloud providers will give more control to the customer around their keys and the kinds of encryption they want to do. But then again, I mean, they are at the bleeding edge of, these, at least from our standpoint, bleeding edge of secure, private, best practices all put in. Like they have more security personnel on staff working on these things than we could ever build or afford. So from our standpoint, it just makes sense to leverage all the awesome work that they've done and, build our apps on top of that platform.
That's some great insight, especially pertaining to the ownership of encryption keys. I think a few years ago, this was a major battle as to who ultimately held dominion over those keys. What we're seeing is, especially third-party adjuvants to AWS, any services that they may offer in the promulgation of these types of services, they're not making a lot of headway unless they can guarantee some kind of dominion to the data owner of those keys, because otherwise, there's a tremendous amount of downstream effect from a regulatory perspective and also from a governance. And then you can factor in some other things like liability and insurance. So I think that kind of conversation is absolutely very, very important, moving forward. So we're down to about 5 minutes left in the hour. I would encourage any participants in the webinar to post any final questions that you may have for the panel in the Q&A. I think we've covered the ones that have come in already. We'll give maybe a minute or so for that to happen. In the meantime, I'm going to give each of our panelists an opportunity to add some parting thoughts to the discussion. Rob Wiliams, do you have anything to kind of wrap up some of the areas that we've been talking about here?
Overall, I think in the last as all technology, it's constantly changing, and if you don't kind of get in front of it and change with it, you just get rolled over. But this has been some of the most exciting changes I've seen with all the different cloud solutions and services out there. It's making technologists more advanced, more rapid, cheaper, and a lot more people are developing. So it's a really exciting time, and all these cloud adventures that we're going on. So I wish you guys all the best of luck. I appreciate it. And if you guys ever want my email, just shoot Max a message, and happy to help in any little project. I like to chit chat with how other systems are going, and there's always nuances to everyone's data. So good luck, and thanks for having me.
Thank you, Rob. Very well done. Rob Leahy.
Yeah, I echo what Rob and Rahul had said on services. We are moving to much more of a commoditized type of situation. I love the analogy earlier, Rahul, about electricity. Okay, I'm not building and supplying electricity for Goddard Space Flight Center. We get that from as a commodity source from the electric company. Whether it's compute, database, and all these other wonderful features that get added to it. I love the ability to do much more as a service and not have to build it ourselves. Government, and I said this earlier, we're unique, we have unique requirements, but that's part of my challenge, is to move us to the more commoditized, the more industry standards, and not have to build it all ourselves. So the opportunities are boundless. Just go forth and have fun.
Excellent. Thanks again. Rahul, bring us home.
Yeah, I agree with everything that both Rob Lee and Rob Wiliams are talking about. I think I'd add to a couple of things. Number one is I don't think we've seen a better age for innovation in databases than now. When you really look at the cloud providers, the kinds of distributed databases that you're now seeing are really disrupting the way you think about data stores. Databases like Aurora and Spanner are more than challenging, the old worlds of the Oracle by providing 10x the performance at 1/10 the price points, just because they're built on a completely new distributed architecture, right? For telcos, for example, you can run 500,000 TPS easily on both Spanner and Aurora, where the best Oracle rack setup, you'd struggle to get. You would have to squeeze out 80 to 100,000 TPS with a system like that with Oracle, right, on-prem. So these are truly game changers, and they are very affordable to most of us who are not investing hundreds of millions of dollars on their databases. So that's part one. The second part, of course, is from a migration standpoint, to try and leverage all of these things. I think the safest bet is to treat your database migration like you would treat your code refactoring. Okay, you build an interface, you have your two pieces of code, switch over little pieces of your loads over to the new setup, see that it is working. When you feel comfortable over a period of time, switch everything over. I think that's the safest way to kind of do these migrations. And I think the migrations are inevitable. If you want to be cost effective, efficient, and relevant, the way things are changing right now in the data storage world, you really do need to migrate to the cloud pretty quickly.
Yeah, we could have made a whole nother webinar just talking about some of the like the Auroras of the world versus the legacy players. I mean, it's a fascinating conversation. So
yeah, even the data, the blobs and the data
yeah,
right, structured, right?
Could do a whole day seminar on this. It's amazing. Well, it looks like we're right at the top of the hour. I wanted to thank Rob, and Rahul once again for great insight, great conversation, some great questions from the attendees. And Max, I think we're just about done.
Yeah, awesome. Amazing, guys. Thank you so much for all of our panelists. I think it was a really insightful conversation. I know you guys have all got super busy schedules, so yeah, we really appreciate you taking the time and joining us today. Thanks again to the audience for tuning in. We did record the session, so everyone who signed up will email that out tomorrow so that you can check it out on demand. And yeah, finally, a massive thanks to DevGraph as well for helping us put together and create this webinar. Don't forget, if you're interested in finding out more about DevGraph, just drop me an email or put it in the chat and we'll put you in touch with those guys. Awesome. Well, thanks again, guys. I really appreciate it. And yeah, hopefully we'll see you again soon.
Thanks again,
Great. Thank you all.
everybody.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.